Well, good evening, and I want to thank Joost van der Leij for coming to join us for this live conversation for the Outsiders podcast. I'm Cy. You all right, Stu?
Hi mate, how you doing? Good to see you.
For those of you who have never seen our faces before, this is our first video that we're doing, and I'm sure you're as underwhelmed as our mothers were when we were born. But thankfully, we've got somebody who can bring a bit of class to our proceedings, and that's Joost. Joost, could you introduce yourself a little bit for us in terms of your areas of expertise and why we're talking to you this evening?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. But my area of expertise is I studied philosophy twice, actually. I did it at an early age, and then I figured out that to study philosophy, you really have to be 35 years old or older. Otherwise, you don't get it, what it's about. So I studied it again. And I actually taught philosophy as a student assistant to freshmen at the University of Utrecht. And then I got involved in all different things, computer business, software. But then I found something called neuro-linguistic programming. And I discovered that I liked programming people much more than programming computers. And as it happens, NLP is most often mistaken for a kind of psychology, but it's actually much more philosophy. So that's my background is quite... it fits very well. So I have two expertise or two main interests in philosophy. First is a philosophy of mind and action. That's basically about what is conscious, what's the difference between an event and something we do, and stuff like that. And also the whole philosophy of language. I'm a big fan of Wittgenstein. Well, basically, Nietzsche is one of my favorite philosophers. Wittgenstein, and yeah, nobody knows him, but he's a philosopher of statistics, Bruno de Finetti. And that's the other expertise or area that I really love is philosophy of statistics. Now, philosophy is already a very small niche, but philosophy of statistics is even much smaller than that. There are very few philosophers who actually find it interesting, but I do. And then by happenstance, or because people heard about me being able to program humans, and then Hanover contacted me. They were just relegated, and they wanted to know whether I could program their football players so that they would then get back into the Bundesliga, which actually happened, but it was not my doing. That was just because they really had better players than their performance should indicate. But unfortunately, they relegated a year after again, so now they're still in the second Bundesliga. But that's got everything rolling, and now I'm working within the football world, both for clubs and for individual player agents. For clubs, I search for players or do second opinions on players they found themselves to have them know what I think about them. Actually did it today again for FC Twente, Dutch club. They're looking for, I can't talk about it, but they're looking for a player. That's that much I can say. And the head of scouting wanted to hear my opinion on 3 different players. But it's all, of course, quite secretive because they fear that players will be bought by other clubs. But they're also working with agents, and then it's basically the other way around. How can we present the player in such a way that the club knows what they can expect from him, so that then players that I find good, I only promote players that are, according to my statistics, are good players. And then we have a number of clubs that I send that information to. And then fortunately, now and then, clubs actually hire the players that I recommend. And so far we have quite an excellent track record. There was one exception, I don't know whether you know him, it's called Czerny. He played for Ajax. And then we advised him to go to FC Utrecht. FC Utrecht actually got him, but he bombed the whole season, didn't match with the manager. So that was our only, blemish on our reputation. But fortunately, FC Twente hired Czerny this year, and he did brilliantly for them. So now my reputation is intact again.
So I guess before we press into a little bit more of the discussion around the difference between statistical philosophy and continental philosophy, I'm fascinated. This is a philosophy and a football podcast. I'm fascinated about in some ways the aberrations, because what it looks like is you've got a modeler system that shows, you know, the very best chance of what we're saying is going to happen, but obviously football at times there can be anomalies that come out. But also Definitely. A little bit about the Hanover and the sort of the working with them, and particularly what sort of work were you doing? Because you mentioned that you were there to sort of help them get promoted. What did that sort of look like, and how did that look like in terms of your interactions with the players and the insiders of the club?
Yes, well, unfortunately, with Hanover, we only got into discussions how we would approach the whole thing. Football is a very conservative business, and they never say no. They are open for any idea, but they never say yes to anything that is new as well. So we never got around to actually work with the players with Hanover. But when we do work with players, then it's all about first. What we do is I have a system that's based on something called Cybernetic Big Five theory. That normally people will say it's about their personality, but Cybernetic Big Five theory shows that we don't have a personality. But what we call personality are actually evolutionary behavioral patterns. Our brain formed in 100,000 years ago. And there are basically two models of the brain. So we all know about the brain that is a network where you, before your puberty, you build up the network. During puberty, the network is pruned, so you only get those connections that you actually use. And then from the age of 20, then you can only strengthen or weaken existing links. That is the whole brain model of how the brain learns. But beside that model is a way lesser known model, but actually shows that depending on what kind of brain cells you have, that you have different behaviors. So there are like 1,000 different brain cells, and some are more sensitive to dopamine than others, others are more sensitive to oxytocin than others. And depending on the kind of brain cells that you have, and this is all neuroscience, so you can actually make a functional MRI scanner, and then you can see what kind of brain cells people have, what kind of structures. So there's a theory from an American professor called Cybernetic Big Five theory. I've created a dynamic version of it and much more practical, because the theory is always very theoretical.
Sorry to cut in, Joost. Is that to help analyze footballers, or is it to use after that analysis, if that's part of it, to improve performance or personality?
Basically, once you know someone's brain, of a player's brain type, you know what motivates them, how they deal with emotions, and how they learn, and basically the cognition. And it tells you a lot about how they, we do it especially with young players, age 15 and older, to see if they can actually make it as a pro player. It's a very, very tough, route to become a professional player. And you have to sacrifice a lot. And we know that all brain types are capable of doing it, but some brain types, it's more into their natural way of living. And for others, you have to really know where the pitfalls are, so you can make sure that they avoid those pitfalls. So that's part of it. The other part is that once you want to influence your players, so that's why I work with player agents. If you want to influence them, then you have to take into account how their brain works. And then finally, is there the interaction between the manager and the player, and the staff and the player is pretty much also, not determined, but let me explain it. The manager basically selects the starting 11 based on his intuition. They have all kinds of data analysis and opposition research, but they're basically, the manager says, well, this feels good or bad, this player. But unfortunately, certain combination of brain types also give people a bad feeling. And the manager cannot make a distinction between whether this feeling is the bad feeling that he has for a player, whether it is coming from his intuition that he's a bad player and he should not play with him, or that it has to do with the difference in brain type. So what we do for clubs is then that they know the brain types of the players and the staff, so they know that if there are frictions or whether that has to do with the brain types or not. And what we do for the player agent is that we actually, I work for a player agent that is very good player, so he can make a lot of demands. So we're actually going to check and say, okay, if you want a player as a club, good, but we first want to check the brain type of the managers to make sure that it doesn't conflict with the player.
Amazing. I've got two questions that coming from that I'm dying to ask you. The first one is, do you do any retrospective analysis on players? So do you look at great players from the past and say they have this personality type, and do they have something in common with each? So do the great strikers of the past have something in common with each other? Do the great midfielders? And second of all, do you think that football has an intellect to it?
Yes, the last part is very easy to explain. Yes, it is a very intellectual game, and the whole business around it. It's so much about getting a small edge on your opposing teams, that the clubs are so much willing to do so much for just a small edge, just a little, maybe 1 or 2% better chance of winning than they used to have. That there's a lot of intellectual interest. I always say that, of course, nobody is interested in philosophy at all within the society, that you two are exceptions. Except, of course, for philosophers. Philosophers love philosophy. But the second place where people love philosophy the most is actually in football clubs. The management, the directors, the decision makers, they are really into thinking everything through. And understanding that the better you understand the game, then the better chance you have of winning.
Sorry, I think I might have phrased it wrong. What I mean is, from a player's point of view, is there an intellect to being good at football?
Well, you have technique and you have game intelligence. Okay. So if you look at how the brain learns, there are basically two ways the brain learns. Actually, three, but the third one is called imprinting. It only happens just after you're born, for the first couple of weeks, 2 months. So you don't use it on football players because it's a bit young if you want to scout babies from 3 months. But the other two are instrumental learning. There's something called the ABC model. And you two are in education, I guess. So most of the time, if you're in education, you know this model, because that model shows very clearly that consequences much more determine future behavior than antecedents. Nevertheless, most teachers, most parents, most trainers, coaches, they tell people up front what they should do, and then forget about actually rewarding people when they do stuff that the manager wants them to do. So what happens with instrumental learning is that the brain makes a probability relation between your actions and your behaviors and what your behaviors get. And in terms of football, that results to technique. So if you want, you learn to kick the ball in just the right way, because then you know it will reach the other player, and he will be happy, and then the team will cheer on you, so you get rewarded for that good behavior. The other way of learning is associative learning. That's basically where your brain takes two different sense impressions, and if they're often together at the same time or just one after the other, then the brain is again making a probability relationship between those two. The easiest to understand is if you see smoke, your brain goes, oh, there's smoke, there's probably fire. And that's what game intelligence is, and it's very important because it has to do with pattern recognition. And so players have to do many things at the same time, but one of the things is scanning. They need to scan the environment constantly, and then and this is mostly done unconsciously. That is not a conscious skill that they can do, because then it would take too much time. But players with a lot of game intelligence, they will much easier recognize patterns and already can pretty good predict where players will go, and they can take advantage of it. Of course, I think the player that is most famous for that is Messi. who is constantly scanning and already very good at predicting how things will go, and then he will suddenly walk off, and then all of a sudden he's standing somewhere that is very profitable for him. So in that sense, it is a very intellectual game, but some players are very good at game intelligence and others are not so good at it. But it's a trainable skill. It's purely the way you're trained and how you learn to play football.
So what overrides what? If you've got a good reading of the game, is that preferable to have, and then maybe like an average amount of skill? Or do you look at players and think, wow, they're incredibly skillful, but they just cannot read this game at all?
So if I'm working with scouts, and we're in the recruitment business, in the recruitment business, they have much more prefer a player with a lot of game intelligence and lacking in skill than the other way around. Because even though game intelligence is trainable, it's much harder to train than skills. Skills is much easier to train. And this is also because I'm only doing data analysis, so I'm clueless about football. I look at players and say, well, he looks nice, and everybody starts to laugh. But the scouts I work with, they can see stuff. So the difficulty of live scouting or video scouting, but especially live scouting, is you see a player and he fails at something. But is he failing because he lacks the technique, or is he failing because he lacks the game intelligence? And that is why sometimes clubs hire players that if I look at the data, I go, oh, this is a bad player. How can you hire them? And they do brilliantly in the other team. But that's because the scouts have also a complete model in their brain or in their unconscious mind, and they can actually calculate unconsciously whether the player is able to adapt and to play on a different position, different role, different team, and then suddenly become a player who will do very well.
I'm fascinated by this idea of almost how evolutionary biology can be expressed through football.
Yes.
And when we're talking about that game intelligence, that at its core, it's effectively that spatial awareness that's developed is our predatory or our defensive instincts, isn't it? It's scanning the environment. So are some players, through quirks of mutation, more evolutionary, in an evolutionary sense, going to be more successful in terms of their game management ability because they're able to scan unconsciously, subconsciously, so much more effectively than a player who, due to just the mutation of how their brain has come together, they might be skillful, but they've not got that ability as strongly. Have you seen any of that? Is that something that you would recognize?
Yes, well, it's speculation. Shall I quickly show you the kind of presentation that I give to football clubs on this topic?
Yeah, incredible.
Let me just start it up. So, can you then allow me as a host to share my screen, Simon?
Of course, yes, I can. Right, multiple participants can share simultaneously. Okay.
Excellent. So this is the company, Football Behavior Management. It's stolen from organizational behavior management. I teach it at a few universities. I thought it better to steal it, something that works, than think of something myself. No, there's no such thing as personality. I'm going through it very, very quickly. Instead, there are evolutionary patterns. Well, we base it in essence, it's based on something called complex system science. I go through it very quickly, but there are 3 requirements to deal with complexity. You have to be able to scale. You have efficiency, adaptability. That is cybernetic Big Five theory. That is the best one. Big Five, maybe you are familiar with it, but these are basically the most. But this is personality, but we don't want it as personality. We want it as evolutionary behavioral patterns. So this is the standard model of cybernetic Big Five theory. It has a lot of, it misses a lot of correlations that are not in the model, but that are in reality. This is interesting because this is work from a Polish professor called Struss. He shows that these Big Five behaviors do not appear in reality in every single possible combination. There are like 25 different combinations if you have the big five, and you can score high or low on each of the big five. But he shows that there are actually only 8 coming around in nature. So here is what I've developed. These big circles are the 4 of the big 5. And so agreeableness, and then the opposite is antagonistic. And conscientiousness has an opposite as disinhibition, and extraversion and detached, and then open for experience and open reasoning. And you can see there's something called meta traits. You have social stability, and you can score high on social stability, but then you will score low on autonomy, or you can score high on autonomy and low on social stability. And the same goes, you can score high on efficiency or exploitation, and then you score low on exploration, or the other way around. And so far it's all neuroscience, very well founded. When I started doing this in 2008, it was still a very radical idea, but nowadays it is part of the textbooks on psychology.
How would you, sorry, Joost, how would you, I'm fascinated by this model that you've developed here, the neurogram. How would you apply this to if you were looking and analyzing a certain player? What sort of conversations would arise out of this?
So basically, that's what I discussed this afternoon. If you have a type 1 perfectionist, then you know he is industrious and orderliness. And those are 2 behaviors that are very well suited for making it as pro player. But if you have a type 9, that's besides here, you have compassion and politeness, but there's also laziness hidden behind it, and a lack of discipline. Then you can still make it, because for instance, my guess is that Messi is a type 9 mediator. But then we know that if you're that the team that is coaching you really has to take into account that laziness is a pitfall, and that you have to hammer in how much important discipline is. The part that is currently purely speculative, we're working with players, but we don't have enough data. The little bit of data that we currently have actually supports the model. For instance, we work with one of the goalkeepers of Everton. He was a type 9 mediator, so he is more into social stability. And my theory is that that you need social stability within the team for defending. Defending is something you do with every player. Whereas the opposite is attacking. Attacking is much more an autonomous activity. So it's much more likely that the players that are autonomous are better at attacking. For instance, the archetypal figure is Marco van Basten. He's a type 5, he's very autonomous. And but unfortunately, I don't have enough data to make it a really hard claim. And then you have the efficiency. Also, first you have the exploration part. So that's the scanning part. You have to explore the pitch to see if you can see opportunities. And if you see the opportunities, then you have to exploit the opportunities by being very able to pass. So the exploration part is game intelligence, and the exploitation part is technique. And creativity, autonomy is very much linked into creativity. So if you have a creative player, then it's more likely that it is a player that is scoring on these behaviors, and defenders score more on these behaviors.
That's fascinating. So, I mean, what's quite interesting is if you look at Leeds United, a newly promoted side to the Premiership, who they have a number of players who actually I would probably put more towards that stability sort of side of things, because the manager seems to want to put across this idea of that compassion and politeness and that sort of side of things. What's really interesting is they've had a player who's come in that they've bought this year, Rafinha, who seems to be a little bit more creative, but I might be completely wrong here with this. But he seemed to have had a bit of a spark of creativity and invention. He still tracks back and defends for the team, but actually he seems to be a little bit more individualistic in the way that he plays. Does that show in terms of for your scoring?
So I actually, because I knew that you guys like Leeds, so I actually prepared myself, and this is the most recent data on Leeds. That's also because in the podcast you said I want to know who are the twos at Manchester City. So I found the two at Bamford. I know he scored goals, but so the issue is that when most people, including the professionals and the insiders and the scouts, they look at what players do well, but they forget to look at what players do not well, or what they do badly. And the system I'm using is basically always seeing, okay, how much good do you in return for how much bad? And in the case of Bamford, he just has too much shots off target for me to like him. Even though he scores a lot, but if he would be more efficient, he would score even a lot more. At least shoot on the goal. So you're feeling, so if you look at the social stability, which is defense, then you can see that there are quite a number of players that have pretty high defense. So it seems that that's also what I saw this afternoon when I did this, is that it looks like a team that is indeed mostly concerned with defending and less concerned with attacking. Unfortunately, I cannot see whether the player is creative, even though if you look at Rafinha, these are numbers that are often associated with creative players, but I would have to ask a video or a live scout to actually inform me on whether they are creative or not.
What's interesting, Joost, with this is that pundits, and whether it's to Leeds or whether it's for, there's been a variety of teams in the Premiership that this year the punditry has been particularly woeful in terms of quite lazy. And one of the things that they've said about Leeds is that they attack in a gung-ho manner without any thought of defence, when actually they're posting one of the highest statistics in terms of ball recoveries in the Premiership, in terms of how many passes they allow the opposition to make before they enact either a turnover of possession or immediately putting pressure on a player. So actually your model shows that actually, although they seem to be on the surface in a sort of a very surface level reading of it, an attacking side, actually what you're seeing here, and I think it fits what actually a lot of the statisticians are showing, is that actually this seeming attacking formation that they play is actually based on a lot of defense, and it sort of fits the players that they seem to have as well.
Yes, definitely, yeah.
I'm interested in where the manager has an impact on individual players. I think what's interesting about this is that Leeds attack and defend as a single unit. And so instead of having teams within teams like some other teams do, noticeably in the Premiership, you kind of have units of players that kind of take charge, if you want, when certain periods of play happen. The videos or not, but when Leeds lose the ball, the entire team attacks the other team, and just to get the ball back. And when they attack together, you'll see the whole team come up to the halfway line, and they will all attack, and you're as likely to see a defender in the box getting the ball as you are a winger or a centre forward. So just thinking about how managers affect teams.
So basically,
is there a case in point to say that if you have a really strong-willed manager, or a manager that imprints his personality on the players, does that skew your model a little bit?
And no, not a model. It will skew. Of course, it will skew the results that get out of the model. But then you can see, for instance, what I told you about Baccherny, that he was doing. Of course, he did not do as good enough for Ajax to stay there, but he did really well in the second team for Ajax. That's why we showed him to FC Utrecht. Hey, this is an interesting player for you. FC Utrecht bought him. And but then he got into a conflict with the manager, didn't play well, and played only a few matches. And fortunately for me, FC Twente then still believed in him, hired him, and they actually got him on loan from FC Utrecht. And then he did brilliant for FC Utrecht. For FC Twente. And then, I at least felt vindicated. And then. But that has mainly to do with his relation with the manager. So the model still works. The model shows he is playing well in this team, not so well in this team, and well in the third team. And then we have to figure out, okay, do we know the reason? I don't know the reason. So I asked my colleagues, live and video scouts, and I say, hey, what's the reason? And they tell me, well, he did not get along with the manager at FC Utrecht.
Interesting. And is there any correlation or triangulation when it comes to deciding things like how much teams are willing to pay for a player?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not in this model, but we have a model that can actually calculate what we call the replacement value. How much do you have to spend to get a player that will either get as efficient or as much contribution to the team as the player that is leaving or that you're selling? Or if you are able to, as you can either buy a player with the same contribution or probable contribution, or you can buy a cheaper player with less contribution, but then you have more money to pay to buy other players. So actually, we did this for Willem II, one of the other Dutch teams. They had a striker called Frans Sol, Spanish striker, who did very well in the Netherlands. And Dynamo Kiev wanted to buy him, and Dynamo Kiev offered Willem II 3 million euros. But Transfermarkt is the famous website where you can look up transfer fees. That's within the professional football world. Transfermarkt is always laughed at because it's not that reliable. But Frans Sol was valued at 5 million euros. So Willem II had to make a decision: do we accept a lower deal of 3 million? Or are we going to wait and see if we can get 5 million from a different club? And then they asked me to calculate it. I calculated 2 million. That was the replacement value of Frans Sol at Willem II. And so when they saw that, they thought, oh, 3 million is 50% more. Let's take the deal. And I think they're very happy with the deal. Another player that we had was Dalmau, another Spanish striker that we found for Heracles. And we showed the data like this. We showed them that he had a very high finishing probability. So they were interested. All the other probabilities were quite low, by the way. But we also calculated that he would be worth 1.75 million euros after one season. And they actually sold him one season later for 1.7 million. So it's like 50,000 close to what we actually calculated. So replacement value is not the same as transfer fees because sometimes the market does really crazy stuff, but at least it gives the clubs a measure of whether to see when a deal is attractive for them or not.
Thanks for that, Joost. That's really helpful. Should we stop sharing the screen and come back to our view? Thank you for that. One of the things I'd like to discuss a little bit in terms of is anomalies. So your model, and please tell me how I'm getting this completely wrong, generally points towards, on the balance of probabilities using this model, this is the best thing that you should go for. But football obviously throws up every so often some real anomalies. Could you speak into a little bit more of to the reasons why these things might happen here and there, and whether or not they happen more commonly in football than you would expect in, say, if you were using that sort of model for business, for example, a business that's been running for a number of years to try to increase that efficiency.
Yes.
So those anomalies is something that I'm quite interested in.
Good. I'm going to share my screen again because but then I'm going to show you, this is the all the calculations behind it. But here what
we'll do, Joost, if that's all right, is we'll also describe what we're seeing for those that are going to be listening.
Yes,
if you are listening, then we do recommend you head over to our YouTube channel because you'll be able to see, because Joost is showing us some amazing things that Stuart understands a good 25% of. I can see it. But what Joost is showing is the graphs that back up and show kind of what he's been what he's discussing with us as well. So we do recommend, if you are listening to this on on a podcast, then to head over to our YouTube channel, so you can see the video of this as well.
It's a good point. I've completely forgotten that some people are only listening to this.
That's okay. That's fine. We'll direct it that way.
Yes. So one of the first things that is important is to actually stop thinking in terms of what is called point probabilities, and start thinking in terms of distributions. So the list I just showed you that the listeners did not see actually has point probabilities. It will say it is 90 probability that the player will contribute to the defense of Leeds. And I said, well, Bamford has quite a low finishing probability due to that he has so many shots off target. But here's Bamford again as a graph, and for the listeners who cannot see it, there are actually 3 different graphs within the thing, and these show the Poisson distribution. And basically, the more to the right the graph is, the better. So you can see that it's in Dutch currently, but the green part, that is basically passing, or everything that is being done with the ball before there is a opportunity to score, or the other team has the ball. And you can see that it's actually an area between 60 and 80 probability. So the average will be around 70. But anything within this green graph will not be an anomaly. Again, you can see that finishing, the blue one, and defending, the red one, are quite low for Bamford. Well, defending is very easy to understand. Finishing has to do with him shooting too many off-target balls. But again, even though the point probability is at 10%, you can see that in actuality it's between something like 23 and 0%. So as long as you start stop thinking in terms of points and start thinking in terms of distributions, a lot of the anomalies disappear. For instance, if you look at the Dutch competition, there's a team called Willem II. I already talked about them, and last time they did very well. They actually made it. They qualified for the Europe League, and this year they're fighting against regulation. Might even be regulated. So that looks like a anomaly. How is it possible? Playing in the same year, both in the Europe League and fighting against regulation. How is it possible? But if you look at their data in terms of distributions, you can see that they have a 50% chance of fighting against regulation each season, based on the results for the last 10 years. And being able to qualify for the Europe League, or the European League, whatever, and also still falls within the distribution. It is highly unlikely that it happens, but it still is like a 5 or 6% probability. But it still falls within the distribution. So that means that even though it looks like an anomaly from the outside, it is actually not an anomaly. So
it's within the bell curve of
exactly, yes.
I've got
one more remark.
So go on.
Because the really interesting thing is, and it's also the hardest to do, is to I don't know how you call them in English, but the one-day superstars, or the one-season superstars. Especially in the Dutch competition, you have players who do very well, strikers who do very well, but then fail to do well when they're sold to and play in a different competition. So that is something that is the most difficult part. But we have a system that it is not perfect, of course, and we prefer to we rather not hire a superstar than hire a bad player. So our system is very much biased into a negative system, in the sense that we are very, you can see what we think of Bamford. I think that many Leeds fans would be very annoyed at how we look at Bamford and go, what, he's our striker, he's 12 goals, what are you talking about? And that does not say that Bamford is a bad player. It's just that hiring Bamford is a big risk. And we are not, I don't like taking risks. So I'd rather search for a different player that has less risk. Even though Bamford might be hired by, I don't know, Leicester and then do brilliant at Leicester.
So it's actually what that's doing is it's managing risk rather, and it's not getting lost in, I guess, in some ways, the personality. And I'm really interested in your appreciation of football use, because Stu will be able to tell you we've been to many a football match together, and I am a hugely emotional fan. And logically, I know all of this stuff is going on in the background, and actually, particularly the more we discuss things with people like yourself, realize that actually there's a lot of numbers behind the game. But I'm still so driven by emotion. Do you find that your appreciation of football has changed as you've delved further into this, or has it widened it? Has it limited it slightly? Do you enjoy football less or more?
I never enjoyed football that much to begin with. But one of the things that is really different is that I used to like to watch the summaries at Sunday night. If I train a lot, and we'd often do it in the weekends, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And then on Sunday night, I would be very tired, just watch the summaries of the matches of the weekend. And I can't do that anymore. I've now watched so many football matches to create a model. I've watched literally 3,000 or 4,000 matches. And I don't understand how people can enjoy a summary. It's like saying, yeah, for these are the 5 minutes highlights. Yes, and what happened in the other 85 minutes? So that's something that really changed. I cannot see a summary anymore or highlights.
And I guess your appreciation of what goes on is different, because I guess what you also need to be seeing for part of your model is the whole pitch in some ways, in terms of what's the right back doing when they don't have the ball, because that's also going to be quite important in terms of attaching a score to them.
Yes, but fortunately I have a team in the Philippines who does that for me. So they even watch even more the video than I do. But you have to remember, if I watch football, I'm also using the tool we built to actually tag players where they contribute to positive results or negative results on the pitch. So when I watch football, I only see one team. So if that's the team that I'm analyzing, and the other team, if you ask me questions about that, I have no clue what they did. So it's very different. It's also what's very different is watching from television or live. I've done live because we can do it in real time. For Kortrijk in Belgium, we actually done it while sitting on the stands, and that is so much different from how football looks if you see it at the telly. But the real issue here is that you guys, that is what also took from your podcast, as you guys are the customer. Football is not a sport. Football is entertainment. If football was unable to get you emotionally aroused like that during the matches, you wouldn't give your money to the football clubs.
Well, that's quite true. That's quite true. It's interesting. It doesn't take much to get Cy emotionally aroused, I have to be honest. When we go to the football, we have very different ways of looking at football. And this is why we are interested in philosophy alongside football as well, because I think what we do is we take our philosophy of life from the street and walk into a football ground, and then it's kind of distilled in this mad arena of high emotions. I'm quite diplomatic. I see us going a goal down and I say, well, you know, the season evens itself out and everything's okay, and we're having a bit of a bad half an hour and things will buck up and someone will say something and a leader will emerge, etc., etc. Whereas Simon sits on the edge of his seat and starts gnashing at his fingers and cursing in players' mothers and stuff like that. The thing is, one thing that I said on the last podcast was that I'm slightly unnerved by statistical analysis, especially when we use the word philosophy. So I guess for me, the reason why football is so intriguing is it's almost like a chess match where there's an infinite amount of moves. And I think the reason why I love philosophy is because there are no answers. And when a manager is sacked or a player is the hot thing at the moment, and then, as you say, half a season later, no one cares who they are, for me, that's the unanswered question. No one really knew that was going to happen. No one really knew that was going to work out. Whereas what you're doing is you're finding unequivocal truth. within
No,
football,
no,
which makes me nervous.
yes, no, I hate truth. Truth doesn't exist except for mathematics. There's no truth in reality. There's only probability. So that's also what the head of coaching of Ajax told me when we first met. He said, "Yeah, but if you're able to calculate it, everything, I quit. I don't want to have this job if everything is known beforehand." And many times when you have those players that nobody's interested in half a year later, the insiders knew.
Yeah.
There are very few surprises for the insiders.
Do you look at the state of football and, you know, handing over hundreds of millions of pounds for players and players on, you know, £500,000, £700,000 a week, you know, in wages, and do you see that as some form of spoiling the sport, or people just completely misunderstanding what's going on, or do you think that that's just par for the course?
I think they're misunderstanding.
Yeah.
There's within philosophy, but again, this is ethics and social philosophy, part of continental philosophy that I hate. I think there is Rawls with his theory about if you're born behind the curtain and you before you're born, you're asked how you want to organize society, that everybody wants to have it as equal as possible, because then you have the biggest chance to land in a good place.
Yeah.
I don't buy that at all. There's a counter argument that says, yeah, but how about if we have this basketball player who is really, really a wonderful player, fantastic player, and he just asks everybody 1 quarter to see him play. Then you get a huge disequality. He will earn a lot of money, but almost everybody else is almost the same. You only 1 quarter less than you would have otherwise. So I don't care about the salaries whatsoever. I do care about it, but it has to do with the ABC model that I explained with instrumental learning. So what you see, if you have a youthful talent, he gets a lot of positive consequences for the things he does right. But then he becomes a superstar, and then he gets fans and he gets paid, and then he gets a lot of positive consequences for everything he does.
Yeah.
And then he can also see that his negative behaviors are positive reinforced, and so he starts to become an asshole. So the best example is Memphis Depay, who's played for Manchester United. He had this period where he was completely positive reinforced for all the negative shitty behaviors that he did, and then when he was a superstar, and unfortunately he had a big failure at Manchester United, and that brought him down to normal levels again, and then he became a good player.
I'm thinking about Balotelli when you're talking.
Yes, but I ask myself whether Balotelli has the mental capabilities to actually understand positive rewards and stuff like that.
Where would he rank, like, in terms, if someone came to you and said, oh, you know, we haven't got much money, we need to get out of this league, Balotelli's an incredible player. What would you advise?
He's currently, okay, it is Mario Balotelli, right?
Yeah.
I can put him in the system, see how he now ranks. That will take about 2 minutes, maybe 1, if I'm very quick. He plays at Monza currently.
He's been around, so since his sort of his
he played for second teams and all sorts.
He hasn't played much this season, so let's take the previous season when he was playing for Brescia. And then, because I really don't care about all the stories, I'm only interested in the stats. And here they're calculating.
And that's for me is the fascinating thing, because it's a lot of the conversations around football, particularly in the UK, are around the story. And it's as you were talking about, even our conversation has strayed at times into that continental philosophy sort of side of things, that is a sort of antithesis to what you're doing. And actually there's a brutal nature to what you're doing, because actually what it says is it doesn't matter. This stuff doesn't really matter. It's this stuff that I'm interested in, and this stuff that translates onto the pitch.
Right.
And that's fascinating for us as you're right, where the we're the client, we're the users, we're the ones that plow our money.
For now, but it's changing. So the issue, Balotelli, by the way, scores a 2. So he did very, very badly. I would not hire Balotelli, no matter how much money I would get from his manager. But the issue is that for now, and it depends on which country. So in the UK, the fans are such a big source of income, especially through television rights. But in the Netherlands, most of the income is through the people going to the stadium. It's not through the television rights. And you can clearly show that if they make a couple of good transfers, that they will earn more money with transfer fees than they would earn from the people visiting the stadium. So the issue here is that it's entertainment, but most fans are particularly entertained when their team is winning. Somehow losing is not that entertaining for fans. That's one of the reasons why the club has an interest in actually hiring players that will make sure that they win matches.
Yeah.
But given that there's now so much money involved in transfer fees, is that they can actually now make more money based on transfers than with the audience. So the moment the team understands that they can now earn more money with transfers, then all the concerns about the public go out of the window. They will just hire players that they can see, okay, here we can get a free agent and we can probably sell him for 1 or 2 million euros next season. Okay, I will get him. Doesn't make us a champion, but he will make us money. So, and that is, I would say, now there are a couple of clubs that are already running like that. There's there's a Romanian club from my heart. I forgot the name. Trencin. Trencin is run by a Dutch guy, and he is running the club only to make money through transfer fees. He doesn't care anything else, and he's doing very well. He's hiring excellent players very cheaply, and then sell them for millions.
You can see that actually in the Championship, the second tier of English, yes. With a team called Brentford, who each year are in and around the playoffs. So they're increasing the probability, the possibility that they could get that big payout to get into the Premiership. But they also every year say goodbye to 2 or 3 of their top performing players who they might have spent a couple of million at most on, but quite often they'll go for in excess of 20, 25, 30 million we've had before from Brentford. And it's a model that seems to be working really well for a relatively small club in terms of London standings.
Oh yeah, and they have no history. Like they have very little history, so it's not like one of the big like there's no furore around it. They're just a business model.
And the good thing about it is that you have to sell when you do very well as a team. You have to sell your players. So when Leicester won the Premier League, I was screaming, "Sell the players!" And they didn't. Of course, they should.
Which they have done.
Well, they have a couple, but they didn't sell Vardy. They should have sold Vardy for all the...
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Leicester's a really interesting case in point, because if you look down like their last 5 sales, then you're looking at players they got for scraps, and then they've sold it to, obviously, Maguire to Manchester United for 80 million. They've sold Riyad Mahrez to Man City. They've basically gone to the big teams with all of this expendable money and said, right, hand over if you want our players. But they've replaced really shrewdly. That seems to be, do you think that business model for football will just take over the game now?
Not completely, but more and more clubs will move to that model.
Because I get the feeling that, we hear about Barcelona and Real Madrid being skint now, don't we? That they haven't got any money. They're not going to be buying any big players anytime soon. So it's interesting because, we spoke about Leeds United, and then their chairman came out and said, we want to do the Leicester model.
Right. Just to be clear, I do work for Leicester. I work for the youth development
oh, really?
program. So I do have a interest.
And how are things looking for Leicester's youth development program?
badly, because I was looking for EU players for them, youth players, and
Right.
Brexit basically destroyed that business for me.
Right.
Because you can't get. I found a brilliant right back, 14-year-old Danish player for Leicester. They were very interested, and then Brexit happened.
So what does that mean in terms of why is that scuppered that?
Because otherwise they would have bolted the parents. So you can't buy the player, so you buy the parents, and and then he would have moved to Leicester to finish his career there.
Right.
And now he can't do it.
Right.
And so what is important is that you have this pyramid with the Premier League on top of it, and the Spanish competition is close to the top of it. So these are end leagues. This is where players end their careers.
Yeah.
And all the other leagues that are below there are basically feeding the pyramid coming up. So for us, it's always very important to see, okay, which club are we working with? Where are they in the pyramid? Which are the players that are below them that are interesting for them? And how can they sell them to the next layer within the pyramid? But that is different for the Premier League, because well, Ajax is now and then buying a player from the Premier League, but most of the time that is where we want to send our players to get the big cash out, and then you can keep them.
Is there any player in the Premier League or players just off the top of your head where you look at them and think that they are like latently good, but they've not really been recognised yet? I don't know how much English football that you watch.
I haven't watched it for 2 seasons, so that's like 3 seasons back. Basically, because it is an end league, and the possibility of that you find a player that you will bring to the Netherlands or to Belgium, there's such a low chance. That unfortunately, I watched English football this week. Just because it was on my schedule. I watched the match between Manchester United and Manchester City this weekend.
Right. Okay. And how did you find that?
I don't know. Was there a match between Manchester United and Manchester City this weekend?
It was. It has been in the past couple of weeks. Yeah, Manchester.
No, this was this Saturday, because I had to watch the under-18s.
Right. Okay.
So I only watch teams that are that people go, why would you watch that? Yeah, because we want to know whether there's a player playing for Manchester United under 18 that we can actually, and there's a Dutch guy playing for them, and we want to know whether that is a guy that we can potentially in 2 or 3 years get to the Netherlands.
Oh, okay, okay.
So I'm also always watching the least popular clubs.
If you don't mind, can we just tiptoe away from football just a tiny bit, because I'm interested in talking about philosophy. Right. Now, can I ask, what's your philosophical outlook on life? How would you? I call myself a nihilistic realist.
Why would you be nihilistic?
I have to spend time with him.
No, it's okay, yeah.
But how do you you told us about how you kind of got into philosophy and how you studied it a couple of times, and there's a certain amount of, I absolutely agree that you have to be a certain age to kind of like for it to hit home. But how do you come to it intellectually? How do you come to it in terms of your life?
Yes. So first of all, I'm a pragmatist.
Okay.
So pragmatism is, I think, the most valuable school within philosophy. Pragmatism is best defined as also being interested in other values besides truth. And I'm an extreme pragmatist in the sense that I don't recognize truth. I don't think truth exists. I think truth has to be defined, can only be defined within mathematics. There is no truth outside of mathematics. It's only, you only have probability. This is pretty much the line of subjective Bayesian statistics as proposed by Professor De Finetti. I think he's the best philosopher in the 20th century. Of course, everybody knows Wittgenstein. I also love the older Wittgenstein. I think he was a pragmatist. And then the whole pragmatist, then there is a pragmatist that I particularly like. It's a philosopher called Stitch. He has written a book, The Cognitive Science and the Case Against Belief. And this has followed by enactivism. I don't know whether you have heard of the term enactivism. It's Alpha Noé. This has written a book about out of our heads, and it has to do with that there are and again, I'm a very radical extreme on this line. I don't think there's any content inside our heads whatsoever. So all the content that we generate as a society.
Yeah.
It's a communal thing.
Mm-hmm.
And inside our heads, there are only codes that reference part of these communal meanings. But there is no meaning inside our head. There's only syntax. So that is the position of Stitch and the radical enactivists. And that is basically how I look. We are basically pretty much zombies who have the fortunate that we have consciousness, but we overestimate ourselves. We think that there's a lot of stuff going on inside our heads, and there's not. There's a lot of stuff going on in society.
Would you see that as quite a deterministic outlook?
No, but it doesn't mean you have free will either. So it's basically a mistake to see everything as two opposites. There's a whole spectrum, and determinism makes no sense whatsoever, because first of all, quantum mechanics, second of all, probability. In a world of probability, you can't have determinism, but it doesn't mean that you have a free will. Especially if how lay people define a free will, makes no sense whatsoever. You have to be all-knowing. That's Nietzsche's point against the free will, is you have to be all-knowing to have a free will. If you lack information, you have to make a choice. How can that choice be free if you lack information? Now, we always lack information, so we don't have free choices. No, but don't have free will. But it doesn't mean that there is no such thing as freedom. You're still somehow, has a thing that we badly understand how it works, but it makes multiple options possible. So we cannot predict as absolute certainty what people will do, or how the world will evolve, or how society will evolve, or how football will evolve. Instead, we can only come to probabilities, or as I said before, the Diffnetti has a brilliant term for it. What we do, we create previsions. We imagine how the world will be or how we will be, and that has a certain likelihood, but there's no absolute certainty. But it gives you a lot of freedom, because then all other options that are highly unlikely, also, but they still become possible. So I love probability. Probability gives you freedom, it gets you away from determinism. But you should not, then think that if determinism is not right, then we have to have free will, because that's also highly unlikely.
Joost, that's a fantastic place, I think, for us to bring our discussion to a close, because I can say that you've been one of the most unique voices that we've spoken to through this process of recording this podcast. And I don't know about Stu, but it's made me it's opened my eyes to a whole different area of philosophy, because you're right, it's niche already, but particularly the area that you're espousing. And my hope will be that we can carry on this conversation at later dates and check in as we go forward. But from the outsiders, from Stu and I just want to thank you so much for spending the time with us, for opening our eyes up to the fact that for the insiders in football, there's very little that surprises them, but also that continental philosophers can hide under a rock and discuss whether or not it's a rock or not, and we'll stick with probability and prevision.
Exactly. Probability solves a lot of philosophical problems. If you say, do we have a free will? Probably not. Okay, end of discussion.
That's fantastic.